What Asselin does is to firmly establish the idea that there's a strong connection between French-Canadian nationalism and socialist politics in Quebec. He sees the workers of Montreal as being members of both the working class and members of the French-Canadian nation. What he wants is a society that reduces their poverty and protects their language, culture, and religion. Hi, and welcome to episode 3 of season 1 of Social Democrats of the North, presented by the Broadbent Institute's Perspectives Journals podcast. I'm your host, Dave McGrane, professor of political science at St. Thomas More College at the University of Saskatchewan, and member of the Perspectives Journal's Editorial Committee. From Confederation to the Quiet Revolution, Social Democrats of the North takes you on a journey through history to discover the lives and ideas of the leaders who have shaped Canadian social democracy. It illustrates the importance of social democracy to the history of Canada and gives you some tips for your own activism. In the last 2 episodes, we looked at historical figures who were prominent social democratic leaders in the time period from the creation of Canada in 1867 to the end of the 1800s. In this episode, we are going to move into the 1900s. We are going to start off our examination of the history of Canadian social democracy in the 20th century by looking at someone who had a life full of surprising twists and turns. But he persevered through it all, and he ended up making a vital contribution to Canadian history by solidifying the linkage between Quebecois nationalism and social democracy. I'm talking about one of the most famous journalists in Montreal at the beginning of the 1900s, Olivar Asselin. But before we get into what Asselin was up to in the early 1900s in Montreal, we have to explore a bit of his unique family history. Olivar Asselin was born in a very small rural Quebec village in 1874. His first name was quite uncommon and reflected the radical liberal thinking of his parents. Olivar is actually a contraction between traditional French-Canadian name of Olivier and Bolivar, which is the last name of a famous South American revolutionary. Soon after his birth, Asselin's family became embroiled in a local controversy that generated headlines in newspapers around Quebec. His father was a working class guy. He was a tanner, which meant that he turned animal skins into leather. Reflecting his liberal thinking, Asselin's father testified against the Catholic Church in a trial where his very own priest was accused of intimidating voters to get the local conservative candidate elected. Testifying against your own Catholic priest wasn't going to make you very many friends at the end of the 1800s in rural Quebec. After the trial ended, the Asselin family was harassed so badly by local Catholic clergy and local Conservative Party members that they were forced to move away and set up a tannery in another town. When Olivar Asselin was a teenager, he experienced more bad luck when his father's new tannery burnt down. Asselin was struck with the feeling that as he watched his father's tannery go up in flames, his future was going up in flames with it. At the time, Asselin was an outstanding student at the local college, and he was constantly impressing his teachers and his classmates with his creativity and leadership skills. He had even earned the nickname the Little Corporal, the same nickname that had been given to Napoleon by his soldiers. But Asselin's family misfortune meant that there was no money to pay for his schooling, and he was forced to abandon his studies. He had to move, along with his father and other relatives, to Fall River in Massachusetts in 1892. At the time, Fall River was a French-speaking community where men who could not find work in their Quebec hometowns toiled for hours at low pay in factories owned by rich American businessmen. Asselin went to work in a cotton mill with the rest of the men in his family. He started to experience very harsh poverty, especially during the bitterly cold Massachusetts winter when his family could not afford to buy enough wood to heat their home. At this point in his life, Asselin did not have very many good prospects. It seemed like he would probably become a worker, like his father, and live out his life in poverty in the United States, far from his Quebec homeland. But then something happened that changed Asselin's fate. One day, he was rummaging around in the basement of a local church, and he happened onto a pile of old newspapers from France. He started to read through the newspapers and discovered they were full of articles on politics written by famous French pamphleteers. Then it struck him like a bolt of lightning. He was going to become a journalist and write stories that would bring attention to the plight of poor French workers. He had finally found a calling that matched his passionate, proud, and fiercely independent personality. So he began sending stories talking about the poverty of French workers to the French language newspapers of Massachusetts. Just a little context here. Objective and unbiased journalism was not in vogue in the late 1800s. Journalists were expected to give their opinion and to advocate for the ideas and causes that they believed in. Asselin used his capacity for independent thinking to do just that. He finally got his break in 1894 when he was hired by the French newspaper of Fall River to cover municipal affairs. Asselin decided to use his newspaper articles on municipal affairs to chronicle the stories of extreme poverty of the workers in Fall River. He even shared his meager $12 a week salary with many of the poor who he met and wrote about. In 1900, Asselin moved to Montreal to continue to chase his dream of becoming a famous journalist who would shed light on the poverty of the working class. It is in the time period from 1900 to 1915 that Asselin made his most notable contributions to Canadian social democracy. This is a time period in Quebec that was characterized by the emergence of left-wing working-class politics and the growth of French-Canadian nationalism. Asselin's journalism gained him fame by marrying these two things. First, I will talk about Asselin's left-wing working-class politics, and then I'll talk about how he fit that working-class politics with his French-Canadian nationalism. Soon upon his arrival to Montreal, Asselin joined the St. Vincent de Paul Society and took on the role of a social worker, helping unhoused people in the downtown area. His journalism began to reflect his experiences as a social worker. His newspaper columns denounced the selfishness of business owners who make ever greater profits for themselves while there are people literally starving in the streets. He was particularly scathing in his critique of the English Canadian and American owners of large companies operating in Quebec. Asselin's journalism uncovered how they were making enormous profits off the extraction of Quebec's natural resources while leaving French workers employed by them in horrible poverty. Asselin's solution to solving the problems of French workers in Quebec was straight-up social democracy. He called for high taxes to be levied on rich businessmen. With revenues from these taxes, he said the Quebec provincial government could do three things. It could create social programs like pensions, healthcare, public education, unemployment insurance, and social assistance to reduce the poverty of French workers. It could also establish new government-owned companies to provide essential goods and services such as housing, water, electricity, telegraphs, and railways. These essential goods and services would be provided at prices that all citizens could afford. Finally, he called for the government of Quebec to organize and sponsor forestry cooperatives that would be owned by Francophone workers. These worker-owned cooperatives would reduce the dominance of Quebec's forestry industry by American and English companies, and they would pay their workers decent wages. The business and political elites of Quebec didn't take too kindly to what they considered to be Asselin's radical social democratic ideas. Indeed, they sued him for libel several times over what he wrote in his newspaper articles. He fell into financial hardship as his legal bills piled up, and he was sent to jail in 1907 when he couldn't pay up. He then gets in trouble again in 1909 when his passion really got the best of him. He was covering the provincial legislature in Quebec City as a journalist. When the Minister of Labor was spreading what Asselin considered to be falsehoods about a newspaper article Asselin had wrote, Asselin came down from the press gallery to the floor of the legislature and slapped him in the face. He ended up being sent to jail again, this time for assaulting a public official. As I mentioned, Asselin was not only a social democrat, he was a French-Canadian nationalist at the same time. What I mean by a French-Canadian nationalist is not necessarily someone who wanted Quebec to separate from Canada. Rather, the French-Canadian nationalism that was prominent in the early 20th century in Quebec generally wanted more power to be given to the Quebec provincial government. It advocated giving more power to the Quebec provincial government to ensure the survival of the French language and prevent the assimilation of Francophones into the broader English, Canadian, and American culture that surrounded them. Along with Henri Bourassa, Asselin founded the Ligue nationaliste, or the Nationalist League, in 1903. And the newspaper Le Devoir, The Duty, in 1910, both intended to promote French-Canadian nationalism. In terms of his French-Canadian nationalism, Asselin believed that French Canadians were their own unique race that was separated from English Canadians by their language, traditions, and their Catholic religion. This belief meant that he was against Canada being part of the British Empire. Asselin and the Nationalist League also held some very racist views about the biological superiority of what they considered to be the great Latin race of Europe, and they were very wary of letting immigrants into Canada who did not speak French. Overall, his nationalist views led Asselin to advocate two things in particular. First, he argued that more power should be given to the Quebec provincial government to control immigration, and that meant that there'd be more French-speaking immigrants led into Quebec. And second, he claimed that the Quebec provincial government should be given more power to ensure Francophone control of Quebec's economy, as opposed to having Quebec's economy being controlled by American and English Canadian businessmen. Asselin eventually had a falling out with Bourassa, who fired him from the Devoir, and Asselin was again in serious financial trouble. He tried his hands at politics during this time and unsuccessfully ran in the 1912 federal election as a nationalist Labour candidate. He then found himself pressed into the presidency of the Société Saint-Jean-Baptiste de Montréal, the St. John's Society of Montreal, in 1913 and 1914. And this turned out to be a good thing for him. In this role, he gained fame throughout Quebec by organizing a fundraising campaign to contribute towards the survival of the newspaper Le Droit. Le Droit had been published in Ottawa since 1913. It consistently championed the rights of francophones in Ontario, which were under attack by the Conservative provincial government at the time that was trying to ban the use of French in Ontario's public school system. Asselin's campaign raised $15,000, and that was enough to guarantee the stability of the newspaper, which is still being published today. This campaign, aimed at defending the rights of francophones in Ontario, really brought Asselin into the public spotlight in Quebec. And though he was struggling financially, Asselin emerged as one of the most famous journalists in Quebec and became well known for his socialist and nationalist thinking all over the province. As I've been pointing out, Asselin was an independent thinker, and this often led to unexpected twists and turns in his life. In 1915, he made a decision that shocked all of his friends and allies. He was 40 years old and exempt from being conscripted into military service, but he nonetheless volunteered to fight overseas in World War I in the Canadian Army. Many of the French workers who support Asselin saw World War I as a war between German capitalists on the one side and capitalists of the rest of Europe on the other side. They thought that workers would die in the fighting while capitalists stayed safe in their luxurious mansions and watched their profits grow when they sold their goods to feed the war machine. Asselin's nationalist friends were equally opposed to World War I, but for a different reason. They intensely disliked the British monarchy that had colonized and occupied Quebec for 100 years. They didn't see why francophones from Quebec should go overseas to fight an English king after the way Britain had treated Quebec over many decades. Asselin, for his part, explained that he was actually fighting for France and not England. He said that France had been attacked by the Germans, and he was going to war because France could not fall since it was so important to maintaining French-speaking civilization around the world. The Canadian Army used Asselin to recruit French workers to enlist, and he was placed in charge of the only French-speaking unit in the Canadian Army. He was awarded a medal for his bravery at Vimy Ridge. However, by the time Asselin returned to Montreal in 1919, he had lost all of his fame. He had no job prospects, $15,000 of debt, and most of his friends and former allies now refused to speak to him. He spent the later years of his life writing for various small newspapers and doing social work for charitable organizations who worked with the unhoused and unemployed men of Montreal. In a strange twist of fate, Asselin was recruited in 1930 to be the editor-in-chief of the Liberal Party of Quebec's newspaper called Le Canada. And it was the very Minister of Labor who had slapped in the face over 20 years ago on the floor of the Quebec legislature who recruited him. That Minister of Labor, by the name of Louis-Alexandre Taschereau, was now the Liberal Premier of Quebec and wanted Asselin to assist him in reducing the popularity of Quebec's Conservative Party that seemed poised to take power. Asselin really wanted to get into politics in a big way again, and he really needed the money. But throughout his life up to that point, he had always denounced the Liberal Party of Quebec. He had always said that the Liberals were never doing enough to reduce the poverty of workers during their time in government. He also denounced the Liberals because they were too afraid, he said, to demand more power from the federal government in Ottawa that could be given to the Quebec provincial government. But, as I said, Asselin was proud, and he was an independent thinker, and he decided to go against the grain once again. He decided to accept the position and to use his status as editor of Le Canada to push the Quebec Liberals to the left. He was not particularly successful in this, and the Quebec Liberals actually ended up splitting into a left-wing and right-wing faction in the 1930s. Asselin stuck with the left-wing faction, but the weakening of the party eventually led to the election of the very conservative Union Nationale in 1936. About a year after the Union Nationale got into power, Olivar Asselin died at the age of 62. It was 1937. What is Asselin's contribution to Canadian history, and why should we remember him today? I think that Asselin's big contribution to Canadian history is to mix Quebec nationalism and social democracy together. As we will see in future episodes of the Social Democrats of the North, this is something that definitely outlives him. What Asselin does is to firmly establish the idea that there's a strong connection between French-Canadian nationalism and socialist politics in Quebec. He sees the workers of Montreal as being members of both the working class and members of the French-Canadian nation. What he wants is a society that reduces their poverty and protects their language, culture, and religion. So he has two goals. One is a social democratic goal, reduce the poverty of the working class. The other is a nationalist goal, protect the French language, protect the French-Canadian culture, and protect the Catholic religion that was such an important part of that French-Canadian culture. This mixture of French-Canadian nationalism and social democracy makes him reject the centralization of power in the federal government of Ottawa, something Social Democrats in English Canada usually claim to. For Asselin, the vehicle for the liberation of the working class is the Quebec provincial government, and it needs as much power as possible. This marriage of French-Canadian nationalism and social democracy continues throughout Canadian history, even through to today. In this sense, Asselin's thinking kicks off a trend that shapes Canadian politics and Quebec politics. It is a trend that will be a constant theme in this podcast. I think that Asselin is also interesting because his life contains some important lessons for your social democratic activism today. Asselin's main character trait was that he was passionate, proud, and an independent thinker. These are definitely the traits of a good journalist. You have to be passionate about the subject matter that you're writing about. You have to be proud about what you stand for, because after all, it gets publicized to the whole world. And you have to be independent enough to think for yourself and not be too swayed by the arguments of others. If you are an independent thinker, proud and passionate, journalism and artistic endeavors like music and novels can be a weapon for social justice. They can help achieve social democracy. On the other hand, Asselin's life shows that politics is about teamwork. It's just my opinion, but I think that Asselin was too much of an independent thinker. He made a mistake by supporting World War I when his working class friends and his nationalist allies opposed it. Politics is a team sport, and sometimes we have to go along with what the team thinks, and we have to set our pride and independence aside. Asselin was a bit too proud to admit that he might not have the correct analysis of what was going on at the beginning of World War I. In my mind, Asselin provides us with a contradictory lesson. Embrace your independence to figure out what you think and to be proud of your opinion. But you can't be too independent. Nobody is correct all the time, and you have to read the room sometimes and let yourself be influenced by others and go with the flow, or else you risk alienating the very people that strongly support you. I'm Dave McGrane, and thank you for joining me on Social Democrats of the North, a Perspectives Journal podcast series produced by the Broadbent Institute. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe and leave a review on all major podcast platforms, and share it with somebody you know who loves Canadian political history. Next time, we'll meet a social democratic leader who wasn't afraid to mix religion and politics, and even preach that Jesus Christ was the first socialist. Until then, keep questioning the status quo and stay social democratic.